Hello, I'm Mike Wheeler, and this is Democratic Dialogue. It's been a show that has been on local television, now 1623 television, for more than a decade now, and occasionally I have the fun of talking to people about political issues and areas of concern for all of us. Today we have two guests. We have John Lippitt, who's kindly come down from Reading, and we've got Peter Enrick, who's made an even longer voyage from Lexington. Both of you are associated with Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts. There are so many grassroots organizations that have grown up recently. I was interested when we talked earlier. Your roots go back to 2002?
2002, that's right. Yeah, we largely grew out of a gubernatorial campaign back in 2002 by Bob Reich that some of your viewers may remember. And what we realized coming out of that campaign, we realized two things. First thing we realized is there wasn't very much real infrastructure to build progressive power within the Democratic Party in Massachusetts. And second, that the cost of that was that we weren't being very effective. And in that election, there were several progressives running for governor. We ended up with a not very progressive candidate who then proceeded to lose to Mitt Romney. And coming out of that, we said, what we really need is we need to organize activists around the state, provide them with skills, provide them with connections, and build some real progressive power within the Democratic Party, both to ensure that we elect more progressive candidates and that we advance some progressive issues and that we build a real sense of grassroots power by building relationships, by training people, by being engaged, by building a community. And that's what we've been doing for the last, what are we up to, 15 years now.
And counting. But what's interesting, speaking of counting, you appropriately used the word progressive more than once on this. And yet when we were talking before we went on air, John, it's interesting that some things that are labeled progressive or left-wing or whatever were centrist back in the 60s. So I wouldn't mind if that's where we were today. I mean, in terms of what the agenda is, the progressive agenda, what is it that are the priorities?
Yeah. Well, I guess we do have a mission statement that just addresses the fact that we're working to promote economic, social, and environmental justice. I don't think those are new things, and certainly back in the 60s they were topics of consideration. And also just to make sure that our government is a true democracy, that it's of, by, and for the people, not for wealthy individuals or corporations. And I guess the other thing I'd add to what Peter said is we felt that there was an important to maintain that network of progressive activists rather than having to reinvent it for every election. That's the way it felt. Every time a good candidate came up, we'd say, oh, we need to get involved and support this candidate. And we'd be starting all over from the bottom. So we wanted to maintain this organization, and we've done it as an all-volunteer organization now for 15 years.
So I want to talk about that process, the means, if you will, but I think it's worth digging a little bit more into those issues. I know that you have a background in education, particularly early education. We were talking about the importance of those early years. We're going way, way back, but Head Start was the 1960s, right?
Yep.
So there was general enthusiasm and support for that. Where are we on that today, and what do we need to do to put that back on the local and state agenda?
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the things, of course, Head Start is a national program, and it is critically important. Our focus at PD, Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts, specifically on state and local issues. So obviously we're all concerned about federal issues and federal candidates, and we get involved those sort of on our own, but our real focus here is in Massachusetts. Excuse me. I think the key issue here in Massachusetts is one of financial resources. We are underfunding education, K through 12 education. We're certainly underfunding early education. And a lot of that has to go back to our governor, Governor Baker. And one of the things that Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts is involved in right now is putting together a document that we call the Baker Dossier. all the reasons that Governor Baker should not be reelected.
Yeah.
He has a lack of vision for the Commonwealth, whereas Massachusetts has historically been a leader in this country from the days of the Revolution. And Governor Baker doesn't have that vision, and he also doesn't have the leadership. He claims he's a great manager, but if you look at what's been going on over the last 3-4 years of his governorship, there are management failures across state agencies that we read about in the paper day after day, from the state police to the public transportation system, to our roads and bridges not being maintained, to problems at the Department of Revenue. It's just really amazing when you start to dig into it, as we have in putting together this dossier.
I love the term dossier. You know, you had mentioned you've got a website where I assume that stuff. One way in which you disseminate that material.
Right. The place to find that and a lot of the work from our issues task forces and our candidate endorsements is our website. It's progressivedemsofmass.org. It's all one word, progressivedemsofmass, no punctuation.org. And it's also a place you can get on our mailing list so we can keep you updated about the work that we're doing and the updates to the dossier and the work around our candidates.
The education part is important to me. I'm a Gloucester guy and went through our school system here and had a very good education and went on from there. And a lot of my classmates have done well in lots of different ways. Have led fulfilling lives and been important parts of the community. Beyond education and reminding ourselves, beyond the social justice part of it, and that's a big part of it, if we're going to have an informed and productive society, people have to be well educated in a world that's getting ever more complex. But what else is on the agenda?
Well, so first of all, a little bit more on education is we do have issues working groups on a number of topics, and one of our most active is an education working group, which is partly working on the issues of funding generically, partly working on issues of excessive use of testing, partly working on issues about the vocational education system, which is not serving Massachusetts well. So that's one issue we put a lot of energy into. We've done a lot of work over the years on revenue issues and have advocated for a fairer and more adequate revenue system. We work very closely with the Raise Up Massachusetts Coalition, which has been focusing partly on those revenue issues, but also on workers' rights issues, on raising the minimum wage, on providing insured benefits for workers, and have had some big victories there that we're very proud of. We also work on issues of campaign finance and election access, and making democracy work. We've done work around protecting vulnerable populations. That's one that we hadn't been focusing on prior to Trump's election, but now it's a big focus for us.
But I smiled again. I mean, when you'd mentioned of the people, by the people, for the people, that's Abraham Lincoln in 1863, you know? So in some ways, it almost sounds as if you're trying to evoke the values on which the country was based and on which it grew and prospered.
That's what we think. I mean, obviously, politics, there's a lot of cyclical variation, and we've had a tough time for the last 30-some years of conservative values dominating discourse to an extraordinary degree. I think that we're pushing back on that and finding ways to revive some of the more traditionally progressive views of what government should be, what our relationships to one another should be. But it requires constant effort, and it requires real grassroots engagement and bringing people together around these issues.
So help me out a little bit. We have a state Democratic committee that sort of sits on top of 360 plus city and town committees and so forth, and we see ourselves as dedicated to getting the Democrats who win primaries and so forth elected. Wherever they are on the scale, our view is we're almost inevitably looking at the better choice, even if it isn't necessarily our first choice in that regard. Your Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts group is one of a number of grassroots organizations out there. Maybe the oldest, but how do you coordinate so that you can share best practices and not have everybody reinventing the wheel?
A couple of things. First, among progressive organizations, there are some very valuable networks that we're part of. The Raise Up Massachusetts network is an extraordinary coalition that brings people together, that does agenda setting, that does tremendously powerful work. We're also active in Mass Alliance, which is an umbrella organization of about 25 progressive groups, some with specific issues, women's issues, environmental issues, some more general groups like ourselves. And we work together to endorse candidates, to, again, identify issue priorities. That group has recently done a subgroup that we're an active part of that's focusing on district attorney races to try and improve the criminal justice system. So that's part of it. We also work very closely with Democratic city and town committees, although, as I'm sure you're aware, there's immense variation in the activity level and the orientation of those town and city committees. Some we've been deeply connected with, others we find ourselves kind of in opposition to. I don't think we take the view that you may take, that any Democrat is better than the alternatives. We think
I'm just looking at what the alternatives do.
The alternatives are bleak, but some of the Democrats in Massachusetts, people choose to be Democrats because that's the way you get into office, and sometimes there are some Democrats whose values do not accord very well with what the Democratic platform calls for, what we see as sort of core progressive values. And part of the reason that we came into existence is many Democratic city and town committees will not take a role in primaries. We want to get involved in primaries to make sure that we can get more progressive candidates running for office and getting elected.
And I might add, just we can go back and forth on this. I'd be very interested to hear, John, about your endorsement process. I think our view has been, I'm ready to be persuaded otherwise, but our view is, what did Will Rogers say? I'm not the member of any organized party, I'm a Democrat, right? No. And there is a lot of social psychology that talks about small differences. You can have it within religions, and whether we're talking about Christianity or Muslim or whatever, where people from both those worlds can sometimes talk together, but they have fractious relationships with people that you'd think would be their kin. And what we've tried to do on the city committee level here is encourage people to get deeply involved if there's a candidate they're passionate for. And we don't want to seem to be in the position of squashing somebody who might be an outlier, might not have majority support. And then when there's a primary, we move forward and hope that we can work together. But how do you John, how do you endorse and avoid pleasing some people and alienating others where there is a common commitment to the agenda that you're talking about?
Yeah, that always is a challenge. We work very closely with the Mass Alliance, which Peter just mentioned, where they vet with a very lengthy questionnaire candidates, particularly for the state legislature, and we often piggyback on their endorsements. We do try and focus our endorsements in areas where we feel we can have an impact. We are a small organization, we all are volunteers, so we do selective endorsements and then really try and support those candidates both with financial support and with doing the kind of grassroots things that we talked about in terms of going out and helping them knock on doors and so forth.
And this is pre-nomination, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. It may be worth saying a few words about the gubernatorial race, which is a particularly complex one. Mass Alliance does not get involved, so we have developed our own process for the gubernatorial races in the last few cycles. And what we've done is interviews with each of the candidates very early on to get some sense, sharing that information with our membership. And then in each of the last two cycles, we've then held a forum at which we invited each of the candidates to come, and we got a panel of experts on what we thought were some key issues. We did an hour-long interview with each of the candidates where we really pushed them fairly hard on not only what their views were, but how they would move their agendas forward. And had a large body of our sustaining members and other interested people at those forums, and then on the basis of that did an endorsement process. This year we've endorsed Jay Gonzalez on the basis of that process. And by the way, those interviews with the three candidates who were in the race at that time are all up on our website and are fascinating to watch if people are interested.
Yeah. So Jay, if I can use a first name here, not that I'm tight with him, has a lot of support here on Cape Ann and in Gloucester, but there are still some people who are, pleased to have two good options or whatever, but as a committee, we haven't taken action on that. What we do is we invite people in, and they do come, and we have well-attended city committee meetings on a monthly basis, so we get to hear people. And I think because Catherine Bayless gets a lot of credit for this some years ago, we've got such an active group, people want to come and talk to us because we can get people out knocking on doors. Do you do any recruiting?
Can I go back just
Please.
in terms of our endorsement process? We have a group. We have a broad group of members. I think it's 1,300 who are on our email list and have come to our website and said, "I want to be part of this." We have a much smaller group of what we call sustaining members who have made a financial commitment to the organization. We ask for $10 a month, and those sustaining members vote on our endorsements. And we require a 2/3 threshold to endorse candidates.
I see. So if you had a 60-40, then you're going to...
We would not endorse.
Yeah, because you're concerned about the 40, that they're making a judgment. So.
And if your question was about recruitment of candidates, actually, we haven't sort of deliberately gone out to recruit people as candidates. What we have had is people who have come up through our ranks and been involved through our process who have then decided to run, quite a few for local offices, but Mary Keefe, who is a state representative from Worcester, was one of our founding members and really got our origins with us. And then this year there are two other of our longtime activists who are running for first time to fill vacant seats in the legislature. So I think that is part of it wasn't a deliberate part of our plan, but it's part of what happens when you get people involved and help them build skills and help them feel the value of being active and involved.
I'd also add that we do have local chapters, and we're exploring how those can work and building those. So, for instance, in the area where I am in Reading, we have a state rep district that crosses Reading, North Reading, and Linfield. And I've been involved in putting together sort of a local PDM chapter there of primarily people from the town committees in those three towns. And we are looking at recruiting a candidate to run against the Republican representative who's held that seat for almost 20 years now, 15 years at least, and has had no opposition in the last couple of years. So we'd love to have a good, strong, progressive Democrat to at least vote for, even though it's a tough race to win.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I know that Seth Moulton has worked hard to get people who've done public service, principally in the military, but they'd welcome people who are doing Teach for America. And then there are some women's groups who have recruited women to run for office, which is refreshing. I would assume that if you were to come to people with your potential of endorsing and so forth, you've solved one of their problems, which is how do I get in the door?
Yeah.
Now,
Mass Alliance, who is this umbrella group, does superb trainings and development. So for people who are interested in running for office, we generally send them to the Mass Alliance trainings, and they get very good support through that umbrella organization too.
So we've talked about a bunch of things, and I've obviously engaged in this. We talked about education. We at least pointed out the importance of democratic values in terms of the voting access and so forth, economic justice. But what about money in politics? I'm thinking of the Bernie campaign. This averages and so forth, but his average donation was $27, as I recall. Yeah. If we're talking about state and local elections, I see what it costs to run for mayor of Gloucester nowadays. When I was a kid growing up, that wasn't the case. This is old guy talk, right? Yeah. You know, so I'm wondering whether there's a way of being, I'll use the word subversive, to just do an end run on the money thing through activism, through enlisting people with small donations and so forth. What do you do to try to deal with the fact that there are big bankrolls behind some establishment candidates, I suppose, on both sides of the aisle? How do you get around that?
Well, one thing
You both look at each
Yeah,
other.
where's the answer?
there are a lot of points there. One of the starting points is we are also part of the We the People Coalition, which is working to get the legislature to pass resolutions calling for a U.S. constitutional amendment to overturn the Citizens United decision that's allowed huge amounts of money and dark money, well, we don't know who the donors are, into our elections. One of the discussions we've had at PDM that I hope we'll have a discussion with some of our candidates that we succeed in electing this fall is whether we should think about reviving the effort to have clean elections here in Massachusetts, where we have public funds that match small private donations. They do this in New York City very successfully. They're doing it in Maine. In New York City, the public funds actually match small private donations 6 to 1, $6 for every dollar on a small private donation. And that's had a real impact in New York City.
How long has that been going on, John?
Very recent.
It's 4 or 5 years, I think, now.
And that's municipal. It's in New York City.
Municipal in New York City, yeah. But Maine has public financing. I think Arizona does as well.
And a few other states for some offices and not for other offices. But Massachusetts had a very nice clean elections law that we passed by initiative, but that the legislature never implemented and ultimately repealed. And it may be time to come back to that. The other thing I think that we think we're doing is substituting activism for some of the money. And in local races, they still do require money. But in one of the races that we're very active in this year, in replacing Jay Kaufman, who is the Lexington Woburn representative, it's a seat that should be a very progressive seat. There are a number of candidates. We are supporting one of our PDM homebred women, Marianne Stewart, and she's running against somebody who has very deep pockets and very extensive resources. And we're doing some help raising funds for her, but we're also providing shoe leather. And it's easier to provide shoe leather than to match money sometimes.
Well, that's what I was wondering about. There's a certain point where we all get the robocalls, and I can maybe wistfully wish that would just sort of become yesterday's news. We believe locally in it's person-to-person engagement. It's enlistment.
The data supports that overwhelmingly.
And turnout is so key. Getting people to vote. Many people don't realize that Governor Baker, in getting elected, got fewer votes than Donald Trump did in losing to Hillary Clinton in Massachusetts. If we could get anywhere near the kind of turnout we get in Massachusetts in a presidential election, Governor Baker would almost certainly lose, just because of the demographics and political leanings of the turnout in Massachusetts. Yeah,
and particularly if we read the dossier and see what he has not done. And I hope there's a short version of it, because I would say it's a long list, and everybody, what a nice guy, but what has he accomplished?
Yeah. Well, there is a 2-page overview that's on the website, in addition to the full document, which I think I mentioned is 23 pages and growing. Every 2 weeks, we're putting out a topical release. So the first one we did was on transportation, then we did one on gun violence prevention, then we did one on the state police scandals and other criminal justice issues, and the most recent one was on energy and the environment. The one we're going to do in the next week or two is on education, which we've talked about here. And when you look at those issues, both in terms of what he's done, what Governor Baker has done, and what he hasn't done, both of it argue strongly that we need to have a different governor. From the fact that, transportation-wise, our roads are jammed.
Yes.
Congestion is growing. Massachusetts drivers are spending more time stuck in traffic every year, and he has no plan to address it. Our roads and bridges are crumbling, and not only doesn't he have a plan to address that, but he opposed the indexing of the gas tax to inflation, which would have provided some money to address the issues with our roads and bridges. And we all know about the public transportation and the T, but
we were talking earlier, Peter, you were in the Dukakis administration.
I was.
And I heard him on the radio on GBH last week, still vital and passionate and so forth. Apparently, at 5 p.m., it's not a problem for us on the North Shore. We have our own Route 1 problems. But on the Southeast Expressway at 5 p.m., the speed is 10 miles an hour. In 3 years, it's going to be at 5 p.m., it's going to be 6. In 10 years, it's going to be 3. And that's just a chokehold on the economy. It's environmentally disastrous when you're running a gasoline engine and not making any progress.
And there are
he's
good
done,
alternatives.
Yeah, he's done nothing on that. But can we go back to the turnout point? As you're trying to mobilize people who at some level are impacted by the issues that we're talking about, whether it's education for their kids, whether it's health, whether it's any of these other kinds of things, whose interests would be advanced if they went to the voting polls, but they don't. What's your view of the inertia, what it is that is keeping people from getting out and voting in their interest?
Yeah, there have been some interesting studies of how people think about politics and how they think about government. And the prevalent image of government right now is two politicians screaming at each other. Mm-hmm. And I think it has led to a tremendous level of alienation. People see politics as something that is not in their control and as something that is badly broken. Mm-hmm. And part of what our message is we need to bring politics back to something that is our voices speaking and our engagement. That's a slow process. I mean, there are some people who take that very naturally. Showing that to others, helping others feel comfortable with that is the hard work. And knocking the doors, talking to people, taking the time to get to know people, to hear what their real concerns are, to connect those to what's going on in government is, I think, what we see as the way to try and move that forward. But it's a long, slow process.
So the time has flown here. We have less than a minute here. Probably makes sense to repeat the website URL.
It's progressivedemsofmass.org, all one word, no punctuation. The other thing I would add is that getting out there on the local level, talking to people you know, talking about local issues like education. We need our government to support our education system, and that requires funding and resources to do it. And we have information on all our issues, our Baker dossier at that website, progressivedemsofmass.org.
Well, when we sat down, I told you, I'm still at it, but we live in very challenging times, to put it politely. Talking with you two this morning has been really gratifying and inspiring, and I hope that those who've tuned in today feel the same way. So thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure.
Thank you. Our pleasure.